أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm doing a solo episode as one of my interviewees had to reschedule. And we've been overproducing a lot here lately, so expect it to slow down. But I wanted to respond to a lot of things that have come up recently in analysis, and I wanted to talk about something. One of the criticisms made of the mainstream media, by that we mean traditional large-scale broadcast capitalist media and its state-sponsored subsidies in other countries, such as the BBC, RT when it was operational in America, Al Jazeera, etc., is that the nature of punditry for analysis is that pundits are never punished for being wrong. They are punished for being out of line with an ideological step, regardless of whether it is public or private media that's pushing it. And this was the justification for a lot of the development of first conservative media, talk radio, what we might call small business radio, petite bourgeois, reactionary media, etc. But it's also the justification for left alternative media and left liberal alternative media, starting with Air America in 2005. Pundits get it wrong. They're not punished for getting it wrong. Everyone from David Brooks to Tom Friedman to Paul Krugman, no matter how right or wrong they've gotten, have not lost their ability to spew stuff out on an editorial page from the Iraq War in 2002, 3, and 4, all the way to the Ukraine situation now. But the question becomes, are the counter discourses any better? And my answer is no. They're just as inured to facts. They are just as given to arcane interpolations, and they are just as foolish. Now, I am hesitant to go into Barista Gate because I think it was largely a waste of time. And a lot of people would like to believe that it's a psyop, but it's not. It is maladaptive behavior that is rewarded by the fact that novel interpretations and counterintuitive readings, when mixed with interpersonal loyalty and parasocial relationships, means that you can test your audience loyalty by asking them to believe things that are conversely counterintuitive or contrarian, or even manifestly incoherent. And that incoherence is part of the point, but it is not pre-thought out and premeditated. All right? The loyalty is not a conspiracy, but it does lead off of people deliberately not looking at everything. Now, yesterday, and I'm going to release this today, even though it's a double video, I released a video where I got mad at my audience. And there's some things that came up. So one of the things that I pointed out is a lot of what people asked for has actually already been made, but it's unwatched. I've done videos on the history of the Cordones. I've done videos on the history of the Tool and of labor union organizing in the third period. I've done interviews with actual union organizers. both in the DSA and outside of them. Interviews with people who are positive about labor notes. And I want to do interviews with people who are critical, but who are there. The question that I get from a lot of this that I think is fair is that, okay, so you're right. You can't, help us on local candidates. You can't help us on every aspect of independent organizing, but why don't you talk to more rank and file people? And the answer is, to put it frankly, you're not interested. You say you're interested, but the behavior of people in the algorithm indicates you're not interested. So if I'm going to make those critiques, I have to embed and attract people by other kinds of statements. Now, this is why I don't make my living in media, because this eventually leads to the unvirtuous cycle of clickbaiting and provocation headlines and rat beef drama that you see amongst pundits. But that's not even really what bugs me about it. What bugs me about it is a lot of the analysis is about an inch deep and based in fads and half information. So I've been asked to talk about de-dollarization. One thing I must say is the danger of de-dollarization has been greatly exaggerated, although it is happening, and it's a timescale of when, not how. The issue, however, is that the people who stand to lose from de-dollarization is not just the United States. In fact, it looks as if the people who lose are not the U.S., because the U.S. dollar is doing fairly well, almost too well for export exchange and American manufacturing to be broadly exportable. Although, given our current demographic crisis in labor, it seems unlikely that that's going to be a major issue anytime soon. Nor is it the fact that we don't have the food stocks, because we do. Even under climate change, we're in a weirdly good area for growth of things like corn. We misuse that corn by having it go through things like ethanol, are into subsidized sugars, but we grow plenty of it, and we can meet our own caloric needs. In fact, we can meet the caloric needs of the entire North American continent. That's not the problem. The problem is everything about international trade and globalization is based off two things. One, a non-deflationary economy, meaning not using gold as a primary foreign exchange mechanism, which, by the way, is the historical norm of foreign exchange. Credit and debt systems are the historical norm internal to an economy, or in a colonial economy where you're subjugating someone else. But they are not the historical norm for international trade between peers. We have not been on a commodity money for probably 200 to 300 years. After all, even the Bretton Woods system or the gold standard was a commodity peg, not actual commodity money. But what we have to understand is we've seen the return to gold as a backdrop. And if you don't believe me, I want you to actually look at BRICS. Now, I'm going to talk about BRICS a little bit today. For those of you who don't know, BRICS is a coalition of countries that want to get outside of the Western transatlantic globalization scheme with their own scheme. It has been posited as a severe threat to the West since the late aughts. I've been following it since then, and many times where there's been discussions of de-dollarization since 2008, 2009, BRICS has been seen as a culprit. But BRICS has internal contradictions that we need to deal with. Also, the war in Ukraine, and I'm going to come back to that too, because this is where everyone's been wrong, and I want you to start holding pundits accountable. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the need for the renminbi and maybe a digital yuan to be a reserve currency. But before all the contradictions, to use Marxist terminology, of high debt load small countries that needed to be connected to China, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which was basically a land-based trade route building alternative to the blue water sea lanes of the Atlanticist project, weren't done before this push to de-dollarization. Who looks to lose out on this is actually not the United States, who whose primary threat is internal contradictions, not external ones like Russia, but Europe, whose security and trade has been subsidized by NATO for a long time. Now, that is not to say that Europe does not have a large military. And in fact, if you were to combine all the continental forces with Britain, although you can't really do that now because of Brexit, you would see that Europe has an independent military, almost as large as China's. Maybe larger if you combine them all together. But the problem is, once you remove the EU context, those armies do not have, and navies and militaries in general, do not have any reason to play together. France is interested in anti-colonial and anti-imperialism in regards to the United States, but often doing it to further its imperial goals in Africa, often opposed by US and AFRICOM despite their own imperial goals. Similarly, though, with BRICS, the political tensions between China and India are the highest they have ever been. They've been only increasing since COVID and the decline of China's GDP. Now, China fared better than any major power during COVID until recently, but it looks to be having a business cycle. Many on the left, including people like Michael Roberts, who I normally respect, have said that China was exempted from the business cycle, but there really is no hard evidence for that. Its trajectory and trends mirrored the development of wartime America and the US and the post-war social compact. You can look up the GDP rates and their decline from the 50s to the 60s in the US, and currently from the aughts to the aught-teens to now in China. I have a long memory, so I remember when Western liberal opponents said that China's GDP dipping by below 8% would mean that China would fall apart. Well, I hate to tell you that didn't happen, but it has been dipping lower than 8%. Its GDP trajectory, its profit rates have been net downward. Furthermore, its developmental capacity has largely been put in the tech sector, which makes sense. It wants to compete with the West and integrate with the West and become an alternative to the West for high-tech investment. But it is not, technically speaking, food secure. And thus, a lot of the complications of deglobalization have hit it harder than it may have expected. And by that, I mean the PRC's planning group. They've handled it pretty well, and by avoiding major tensions. But what is increasingly complicating it is that the periphery countries in its sphere, look at Sri Lanka, have been having crippling forex debt servicing problems. So we have a sovereign debt crisis again. What we should note, though, is two things about BRICS. While the yuan is becoming a national reserve currency, what BRICS is doing and has been doing increasingly is dealing with a change in the commodities market. BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now I believe Argentina, represents about $25 trillion in the world economy and trade per year. It's about 24% of the total world's GDP. The G7, that's US, Canada, England, Germany, Italy, Japan, and France, is 45% of the world's GDP. BRICS is growing faster, of course, than the G7. With the exception of India, which also is going to be the outlier for this problem, and I'll get to that in a second. All the major BRICS countries are gold producing. So in addition to talking about the renminbi as a reserve currency, we should actually look at the fact that BRICS has actually preparing for a highly unstable deglobalization and delinking with the return to metalism. After all, why is South Africa even in BRICS? It's not a particularly productive economy. Nor is it productive in the way that Russia is. Now, Russia doesn't manufacture consumer goods, leading to a very small GDP, but it has, we are learning, crucial to the energy development of Europe and has been for the last 3 decades. And it is also crucial to the food stability of North Africa and parts of the Middle East. Every pundit I have heard has gotten elements of this wrong. Deep State Kuvo over at TIR is the only person who I have not had significant disagreements with. And even he may be looking at it from a Western perspective. But what this indicates in all cases is a deep shift in globalization, one that unfortunately conservative pundits have been better on than us on the left, because we have been projecting mixtures of our economic hopes and dreams on either sovereign monetary policy within one state, which is foolish, and I'll get into why that's foolish, soon, because even the U.S. does not have the capacity to produce all of its way of life within its borders, or purchase everything it needs within its own purchasing power within its state. But also that the alternative's got to be based on something that can still trade with the G7 countries. And if currency is not trusted, metal is. Now, this leads us to a problem, and one that we're quickly seeing. Decoupling is not destroying the U.S. as fast as people predicted. Multipolarity has not meant an end to U.S. regional hegemony, nor has U.S. global hegemony been totally ended. And in fact, the trade networks which China relies on and was trying to build the Belt and Road as an alternative to are still dependent on both the financial and military infrastructure of the blue water navies of the United States, Britain, and Europe. China, for all its military development, and it has an impressive military development, has not really invested that much in blue water technology. It has 3 carriers. It is mostly interested in land war, meaning that for all the accusations of the West that it has imperial ambitions, it has been mostly limited itself to land trade and traditional modes of defense. This is not to say that all of China's motives are altruistic as a nation, but it is to say that it has been serious about its commitment to going about the future in a different way. What it has not seemingly been serious, though, is exporting its model and spreading socialism, even its socialism, to the rest of the world. Reasons for that are complicated, but probably have to do with the fact that a premature Cold War with the West would have ruined its developmental goals. So are you holding the pundits who aren't looking at this as a coherent system together? And for that, are you holding the fact that there's been an increase of gold reserves in the BRICS countries this entire time as an indication that maybe some of the narratives you're hearing off of left economic theory are more complicated? Not entirely wrong, as I think modern monetary theory has led to a lot of improved understanding of the capitalist core economies. But there's a reason why small nations haven't been able to do it. There's a reason why the only currency sovereigns are basically the G7 countries. And with the G7 countries in Europe being excluded, while including a few from the old English imperialism. This can't be ignored or waved away just as ideology, or even as a lack of understanding between legality and sovereignty. In some ways, we have to go back to older modes of analysis, older geopolitical and class modes of analysis, which is rooted in early Marxism. Now, Spencer Leonard and I recently had a discussion that I'll release sometime in the next month or two on the development of imperialism and Bonapartism. One of the theses that Spencer Leonard is operating off of is that Bonapartism was the development and natural result of what would become the imperialist crisis of capitalism. Now, I'm going to point this out to some people. Read this book, Historical Materialism by Nikolai Bukharin, and his book on imperialism, which was written before it. These two books are actually really important for understanding the extension of Marxist political economy. But basically, Spencer Leonard argues that Bonapartism was the almost ubiquitous form that the contradictions of capital would have to take. That the representative republicanism of the bourgeoisie would necessarily become more repressive, and that democratic reaction would emerge in the figure of increasing executive strength. This seems to be true worldwide and as the trajectory of the 20th century. While fascism is a specific form of Bonapartism from the Marxist perspective, it is a specific development out of capitalism in a crisis, which absorbs both elements of the left. Renegade social democrats were the core of a lot of the intellectual leaders of fascism, and the right, religious and national ideas being reincorporated in a conservative and reactionary and expansionist way. There's a reason why it mirrored New Dealism in America and the beginnings of Fordism, social democracy and non Warsaw Pact Europe, and in Warsaw Pact Europe, Marxist-Leninist increasing dependence on a key figurehead and a strong centralized state. Even when attempts were made to weaken and destroy bureaucracies, as they were done in both the USSR and the People's Republic of China, one has to deal with the fact that the fundamental overpowering of the executive made these states both more fragile, different factions able to assume various different roles as soon as the singular figurehead was emergent, and less adaptable. But it was also the only way to hold these systems together. But this was also true in the West. James Burnham pointed out in The Managerial Revolution, a book where he basically begins to lay down the work for making tacit concessions to the fascists, which he makes even clearer in his book, The Machiavellians. Note everyone he cites, even though he doesn't note their fascist relationship, from Michel Robert to Pareto, all come out of the fascist school. But that's not to diminish the truth of what he was saying. If we see Bonapartism as the primary form of government as capitalist profitability crisis goes into imperialism, it all begins to make sense. And so does it begin to make sense of now. But this leads to an interesting predicament, because the political motivations of some of these Bonapartist figures, even the wise ones like Xi, to reactionary ones like Modi, lead to coalitions between groups of people that have opposed politics, but only marginally aligned economic interests, meaning they're aligned against something else, but not with each other. This is why BRICS has never been able to unify against the G7. The transatlantic state, which makes up the majority of the G7, is a result of World War II. And for most of this time period, Europe has benefited from relatively low cost to access to secure trade that it can make up for the infrastructure it lost with the fall of the British Empire and the gentlemen's agreements which ended those settlements. And again, I want Spencer Leonard's discussion of who actually settled the national revolutions in the developing world versus who led the insurrections is helpful here. What begins as the revolt of the masses and a protracted people's war ends as a gentleman agreement between different elites. This is not ultra-leftism to say this. This is just a fact. The Soviet Union's own need to find a way to strategically build up its forces by encouraging national development as modernization led it to abandon some of the central insights of Marxism, turning a temporary necessity into a permanent good at its own detriment and our own understanding. Hence the shift from Zimmerwaldism to campism. And this is to view states and not classes as the primary function of politics and of how politics should move, thus pretending that the systems of capitalist trade and international development were national and not global in some crucial way. That has limited all our understanding of what is going on. The national interest politically is volatile. While I've been talking about BRICS and the economic coalition being built there, which has been accelerated by the Ukrainian situation, we also have to admit that the Western pundits and many of the Eastern ones got key things wrong. Despite prepping for the war, Russia's initial output was not great. But then Westerners used that to pretend that Ukraine could have ever won the war. That has never really been a viable option. How long they can hold out is unknown, because generosity to keeping the Ukrainian forces supplied is unknown. But remember that if we learn anything from the Middle East, that even if the Ukrainian government falls and Zelensky is shot dead, this will lead to something like an Afghanistan situation, what we call fourth generation warfare, what we might even call now fifth generation warfare. An occupation that would rebel not only against Russia, but against even a puppet government instantiated to work with it. But there is no way that Ukraine, without the direct military involvement, not the indirect, but the direct military involvement of NATO, can take back the separatist regions or Crimea, Russia in it. Military analysts who are realists have known this for a long time. Not just John Mearsheimer, but people who are opposed to him, like Peter Zeihan, have been pointing this out. Zion predicted the invasion almost to the year, and he predicted it from 2013 forward. We have a narrative to want to place blame because we want to believe in state heroes. But this has led us to be fundamentally misunderstood in our analysis in a key way. Capitalism is not bound by a state, and all the states currently acting, even the ones who maybe sincerely aspire to be non-capitalist states, have to depend on that system and have not been able to fundamentally alter it. As I've said many times, China may be able to shoot a few capitalists and to hang a few bankers, but what it cannot do is force all of international interest rates and all of global capital investment to do what it wants, nor could it produce all of what it needs within its own borders. No country can. Some countries can come closer than others. And this is where the underestimation of Russia has been severe. While Russia may not have been as pronouncedly dominant on the battlefield as thought in its initial preparations for the war, went further south than expected, when Russia stopped trying to make a beeline for Kyiv and started going back to its strategic, slow annexation of the areas in which it already has natural allegiance, it became clear that Russia is actually doing okay. Not as well as one would have thought for such a large and developed military, but one that can hold its own. But so can the Ukrainians. And at this point, there's no way for Ukrainian civil society not to be made more reactionary. This is a logical response to war. Just like the whole idea that there was a three-dimensional chess going on to weaken NATO politically has been utterly bungled. But concurrently, the idea that Western sanctions would have brought Russia to its knees has also been utterly bungled. What it has done is accelerated multipolarization. But people have not looked at what that actually means. Multipolarization means a return to the 18th century in regards to geopolitics. It means fragile coalitions with different groups trying to secure their own trade routes instead of it being secured by one hegemon, either the Roman Empire, the Mongols, or the British or the United States. Capitalism has to develop to imperialism because it has to grow and find new markets. If it cannot, it will start to wither. If it cannot grow, it declines. It is not possible for capitalist dynamics to remain steady state without impoverization and massive wealth inequity, which you are beginning to see, just like you saw at the beginning of the 18th century. This is why I've become to be a believer in Kondratiev waves, despite the criticism that they may indeed be noise, because they are fairly predictive of these epochal shifts in capitalism, which come when you have profitability crises. And how do you judge a profitability crisis? Not on the individual wealth of capitalists who may be hoarding money, but on the investment returns in the overall system, and whether or not they are maintainable without government fiat and on an international, not national level. Again, read this book. But this leads me to this book, Marx and Keynes. It is my contention, and it's my contention for a while, that the left and the right have both been inadvertently trying to critique and revive a dying system. In the case of the right in the United States, it is trying to revive the expansionist liberalism of what led to the post-war social compact, but with the norms of the 19th century. In the case of most of the left liberals and a lot of the left, it has been trying to revive the New Deal without the context of the New Deal, without the Soviet Union to scare the capitalists into place. After all, China does not do this, but China is not making the U.S. capitalists afraid. In fact, what they want is access to China's markets. Now that I've spelled this out, I want you to ask, how many of the narratives that you've seen on the left have just been as wrong as the mainstream media? De-dollarization leading to dollar collapse? Well, de-dollarization is happening much slower, where it was predicted to be almost immediate. And Russia's economy, even though it was left out of SWIFT, was forced to innovate quickly and actually adjust to and grow to probably a level more realistic to what it actually is. And at the expense of Europe subsidizing much of its own development off of cheap Russian energy. There are 1,000 crises coming down the line. People who start seeing in them simple narratives in which there's a clear, easy winner are just usually wrong. Everyone's best laid plans are being thwarted by the complexity of what has emerged in the 20th century. Because even the people shut out of the G7 are still dependent on many of the things on which it built. Just like people who opposed the British Empire were dependent on its trade routes. We do not know what will emerge in the future, but it is unlikely when you add in climate change that anything will be a clear, glorious leader to which will carry you off to a socialist future without things happening independently in the developed capitalist world. So you should not be counting places out, but nor should you be hoping that they will just do everything for you. But you need to hold your pundits more accountable, not just for flattering you. A lot of people, because of Russia seeming to be the aggressor, and I shouldn't say seeming, they were the aggressor in starting this war, have basically turned themselves into Christopher Hitchens to quote one of the better points Ben Burgess has ever made, to justify backing up a resistance, but that also shoring up a NATO dominance. It is almost a dialectical contradiction. Furthermore, a lot of people have been responding by picking up facile campism. Now, we should all be hoping for peace with Russia and a negotiated peace which is fair to these nation states so that we can all go back to the focus of trying to survive the other changes coming without descending into global nuclear war. But let's be honest, our input into that, either in Russia or in America, is minimal. They are all run by small elite factions. Furthermore, the simple narrative promoted by people who want one or the other side to simply win has mostly been moral posturing and without much substance. especially in the side of those who supported Ukraine. But we should not forget the situation which led here was not any one side's fault, but a bunch of sides' faults and a bunch of bad actors. And pretending to pick a side in that is like pretending to pick a good side in World War I. There isn't one. But concurrently, a lot of people's hopes of highly developed modern monetary theory, one, non-imperialist economies developing from this, and multiple global orders developing in this multipolarity are also, frankly, pipe dreams. The instability this causes will make such development very hard, and it will make global nuclear war ever more possible. Globalization will begin to unravel, if not from geopolitical tensions, but also from climate change itself. The nations that will do well are probably the historical power players, which would be the real major powers in the Eurasian landmass, India, China, and Russia, who will have tensions, and we already see this between India and China, as we've seen, emerge from their new dominance, but also with the United States increasingly focusing on itself. After all, North America can meet even its own geochemical needs. It produces enough oil for oil independence, even if it doesn't refine it all here. And while the demographic shift will make converting something else in the future hard, as well as internal politics really making everything fragile. Internal politics will make everything fragile in every nation that I've talked about, except for China. Hold your pundits accountable for not having a suitably complicated view of the world. The complicated view of the world will likely not flatter you. Now let's go back to labor. There's been a reemergence of labor agitation like we've never seen. And we've also seen discourses which seem to be aimed at disempowering it. For whatever reason, this is a tendency within leftist discourses that are pretty profound. Now, disempowerment is not criticism. You can criticize, for example, the Starbucks union's hyper-fragmentation because of the nature of Starbucks shops. Although it's not franchise shops, I've once said that. So the Starbucks has a little bit easier of a time, but its ability to negotiate is still going to be at a shop level in very small batches in a way that does not replicate industrial unionization. Now that's, however, not to say that Starbucks baristas are not deserving of unions or reactionary or some other nonsense. But it's also to say that the much vaunted return of labor militancy is not undialectical. Because the irony of all this, and I've said this before in my angry piece, it is also true that during this time period, what we have seen in regards to labor militancy is the demilitarization and deunionization of a lot of the private sector during COVID. Furthermore, to combat the fact that labor power for things like teachers and government employments are getting higher, the government itself, while the Democrats are touting the return to labor militancy, supposedly, are also themselves crushing things like railroad strikes, and many states are doing things like slow decredentialization of teachers. Florida being the vanguard here, instead of moving like before to decredentialize to the back door through charters and vouchers, we will now see just decredentializing through special exemptions given to combat veterans and this, that, and the other, who people will see rightly or wrongly, because the demographic response to combat veterans is more diverse than just conservative. Shift into schools. And since we're also seeing the decredentialization of the military itself, it means that theoretically you could have teachers who have been given a 5-year voucher to become fully credentialized who do not even have a high school diploma. are a GD. Now, is that the end of the world? No. It's actually an end of one form of labor aristocracy. But it will accelerate conditions of the social infrastructure declining. But just defending the social infrastructure for its own sake has been the left liberal prerogative for a long time. I mean, I've even heard, seriously, I even heard on Slate 3 years ago arguments about humanizing ICE, not abolishing it, because we should abolish agencies that are regulatory, because more regulation is inherently good. These are the kind of path-dependent trackways that liberals get on. But the left has not really fundamentally shifted from that itself. It's focused on sovereignty and liberal progressive developmentism. Some of these are necessities, don't get me wrong. But they have pretended that the state was declassed. But then these same people have been shocked when they cannot use the state to do the things that they want to do to empower the proletariat or whomever, the oppressed. Pick your call sign. It does matter the distance substantively, but here it really makes no difference. And that is because who pays for these governments to stay in power? And if you think it's just the United States where this is a problem, look at all the governments in Europe and the kinds of cul-de-sacs they're getting into right now. It seems like Bonapartism is the state of the day, as parliamentarism has become incoherent, and the U.S. congressional system never made a lot of sense in the first place. And we see this increasingly in the increased power and exercise of the state to use emergency measures over minor things, such as the truckers' convoy. For whatever we may say about the truckers' convoy and the state response to it, invoking national emergency over it is seemingly kind of a joke. Hold your pundits accountable. Hold me accountable. But also realize what they should be doing. Don't hold me accountable for something I'm not trying to do, nor can I really do through this media. But don't put all your faith and hope in dreams and call words that you pick up from other states because it's convenient to them and because you're projecting upon them because you don't know them. And don't let people fool you, be called out briefly for fooling you, and then let them return to the norm. The left, a lot of its norms shield it from accountability. And we have to be honest about that. Council culture and a way to hold people accountable was also a way to shut down the questions of why things were not working and what was failing and why it failed. We have to remember that Obama, for example, ran as an anti-establishment candidate and won, and became the ultimate establishment figurehead. Similarly, the contradictions in the Republican crisis have not been resolved by Trumpism and will not be resolved by Trumpism. Nor does either side of the American partisan divide have full faith in democracy, because democratically things are going against both their plans and will continue to. And this crisis will continue to be unresolved. And between that and climate change is the real threat to the United States, not these external threats. Hold your politicians accountable. Hold your pundits accountable. Hold your media accountable. But also, look at what you choose to consume. People give you largely what you ask for, not what you say you ask for, but what you actually do. If you say you want rank and file discussions or discussions of geopolitics, actually do them, because and watch them and take them in. Because frankly, when I do those analyses, that is mostly the least watched shows that I make. So if you're complaining that I'm not giving you what you want, but you want rewarding what you're asking for, then what do you expect? Which is why pundits flatter you and lie to you, because you reward it. The ultimate irony of all this is that it's not a conspiracy. It's your own behavior that is driving a lot of this. And I don't mean you as individuals, but you in aggregate. For all your complaining about this, that, and the other, this, that, and the other is what gets people engaged. And for all people complaining about things like Baristagate, and you'll notice I'm not going into specifics about that, because that engagement has kept it going for weeks, despite the fact that it's kind of a useless argument. And it has alienated and broken up even factions that I don't really like. How much does that penetrate into the real world? It's hard to say. But what I can say is what happens on the internet tends to become things in reality, whether we like it or not. Is that a substitute for community like some people think? Does it fill in gaps? Absolutely not. If it did, you'd be a lot more effective at things than you are not. Have a nice day. Like and subscribe if you're interested. And if you're not interested, don't. Bye.